This is the moment the United States decided that enough was enough. Not with words, not with a press conference, not with another round of strongly worded statements that fill the space between today's crisis and tomorrow's negotiation. With ships, with aircraft, with the largest concentration of American naval firepower assembled in the Middle East since the Iraq War of 2003, a force so overwhelming in its scale, so deliberate in its positioning, that every government on the planet woke up this week and understood something it had been pretending not to understand for months. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, and America built a $100 billion armada to open it back up. I have spent the better part of 30 years studying how naval power shapes the politics of this region. I have watched the Strait of Hormuz function as a quiet pressure valve, the place where energy markets breathe, where 20% of the world's traded oil moves every single day, where the economies of Japan, South Korea, India, and a dozen European nations depend on the assumption that the water stays open. And I have watched Iran understand with remarkable patience and precision that controlling that narrow strip of sea gives a country of its size a leverage over the global economy that no missile program and no nuclear negotiation has ever fully replicated. What is happening right now in the Persian Gulf is not a skirmish. It is not a provocation. It is a structural confrontation between two fundamentally different theories of power, one built around carrier strike groups and naval dominance, the other built around geography, mines, swarm boats, and the calculated willingness to make 20% of the world's oil supply disappear overnight. And the outcome of that confrontation will shape how every nation on Earth calculates its security for the next generation. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now. Share this analysis with someone who needs to understand what is actually at stake here. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because this story does not belong to one country or one region. It belongs to everyone who fills a gas tank, or pays an electricity bill, or works in an economy that runs on energy. Now let us get into what is really happening. To understand why a $100 billion armada is now sitting in the Persian Gulf, you have to understand something that most people in the West have never taken seriously enough. Iran's Hormuz strategy is not a plan that was invented last month. It was built over 4 decades, piece by piece, with the kind of patient institutional discipline that democracies find almost impossible to replicate. Go back to the 1980s. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iran mined the Persian Gulf. It attacked tankers with small boats and shore-launched missiles. It turned a commercial waterway into a combat zone and held the global oil market hostage with a navy that, by any conventional measure, should not have been capable of doing so. The United States responded with Operation Earnest Will, escorting Kuwaiti tankers through the danger zone. It worked, but it worked because Iran at that time was exhausted by 8 years of war and operating with technology that was already a generation old. What Iran built in the decades that followed is a completely different animal. Tehran looked at what happened in the 1980s and drew a specific lesson. The lesson was not that mines and swarm boats cannot work against American power. The lesson was that mines and swarm boats, combined with land-based anti-ship missiles, with sophisticated sea drones, with underwater systems, and with the willingness to accept the economic consequences of closure longer than any Western government believes is politically survivable, that combination creates something qualitatively different. Something that military analysts now call an anti-access area denial architecture. And in the Strait of Hormuz, where the water is narrow, the ranges are short, and geography compresses every tactical advantage the United States normally enjoys, Iran built that architecture with a deliberateness that should have commanded more respect than it received. On the 28th of February this year, when American and Israeli airstrikes began, Iran activated that architecture. Within hours, the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which a quarter of the world's seaborne oil normally flows every single day, was effectively closed. More than 600 vessels found themselves stranded. Daily transits collapsed by 90%. Energy markets in London and Singapore moved immediately and dramatically. And the United States, which had spent months planning the military campaign against Iran's nuclear program, found itself staring at a consequence it had, by the accounts of 2 sources familiar with the initial planning, genuinely underestimated. That underestimation is the backstory that makes everything happening right now make sense. At approximately 10 in the morning Eastern Time on the 13th of April, the United States Central Command announced the beginning of a formal naval blockade of Iran. But the blockade was only the visible moment of a deployment that had been building for weeks before that announcement was ever made. USS Abraham Lincoln and its full carrier strike group had arrived in the region on the 26th of January, carrying FA-18 Super Hornets, F-35C Lightning IIs, EA-18G electronic warfare aircraft, E-2 Hawkeyes, and a full complement of guided missile destroyers and cruisers positioned to provide layered air defense across hundreds of miles of open water. USS Gerald R. Ford was already in position off the Israeli coast, with 14 Air Force refueling tankers deployed at Ben Gurion Airport, enough range to put carrier-based aircraft over targets deep inside Iranian territory. In total, more than 10,000 American military personnel, supported by over a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, were now committed to a single operational objective, forcing the Strait of Hormuz open. The financial weight of that force is not a small number. When you add the cost of 2 carrier strike groups, their aircraft, their weapons loadouts, their support vessels, their intelligence assets, their logistics chains, and the shore-based infrastructure sustaining the entire operation, you arrive at something in the range of $100 billion of American military capital converging on a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Pause. 21 miles. That is the width of the gap that $100 billion of American naval power is now trying to force open. And on the other side of that gap, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, operating small fast attack boats, shore-launched missiles, sea drones, and a minefield whose exact layout, according to U.S. military intelligence, even the Iranians have partially lost track of, is making that 21 miles feel like the most contested stretch of water on the planet. While the Abraham Lincoln's Air Wing was conducting its first operational sorties over the Gulf, something else was happening simultaneously in the diplomatic channels. The governments of France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Japan issued a joint statement declaring their readiness to participate in efforts to reopen the strait. That statement sounds like solidarity. In practice, it is something more complicated. Because when you read what those governments were actually prepared to commit, measured statements of readiness, not warships in position, not mine-clearing equipment already deployed, you begin to understand that America is doing the heavy lifting of this operation essentially alone. Its allies are watching. They are supporting. But the $100 billion of naval capital in that water is almost entirely American. While those 6 governments were drafting their statement, a third dynamic was unfolding in Tehran. Inside the IRGC command structure, the activation of the Hormuz strategy was creating its own set of internal pressures. The closure of the strait had given Iran leverage, but leverage is not the same as a winning position. Iran's own economy runs on oil revenues. Its partners in Baghdad, Damascus, and Sana'a depend on supply chains that pass through the same water. The calculation that closing Hormuz would break American political will faster than it broke Iranian economic capacity, that calculation was now being tested against a reality that was proving more complicated than the models suggested. What happened inside the rooms in Washington, where this decision was made, deserves more honest examination than it has received in the daily coverage of fleet movements and diplomatic statements. The decision to build toward a naval blockade rather than an immediate forced reopening of the strait was not, according to individuals familiar with the interagency deliberations, an obvious one. There were serious voices within the policy structure who argued that the blockade approach, choking Iran's ports while leaving the strait nominally open for non-Iranian commercial shipping, was a more sustainable position than a direct military campaign to clear Iranian mines and defeat Iranian fast attack capabilities in close quarters combat. Their argument was grounded in something real. Clearing mines from the Strait of Hormuz is not a quick operation. The IRGC has had decades to study exactly where to place them, exactly what patterns to use, and exactly how to make the clearing process as dangerous and as slow as possible. The counter-argument was simpler and ultimately more persuasive to the people who had to make the call. 600 stranded vessels, a 90% collapse in daily transits, energy prices rising in every economy on Earth, and an Iranian government that had begun charging commercial ships a toll of up to $2 million per vessel to pass, effectively taxing the global oil supply as a revenue stream. That last detail, when it landed on the desks of economic advisors inside the National Security Council, shifted the internal debate. This was no longer purely a military problem. It was an economic one. And economic problems of that scale have political consequences that move faster than mine-clearing operations. The cold calculation that emerged was this: the blockade would impose economic pressure on Iran faster than a direct military campaign would impose military pressure on its Hormuz assets. Time matters when 600 ships are sitting still and global energy markets are pricing in permanent disruption. The decision was made, and it was made not in spite of the risks, but with a clear-eyed understanding that the risks of inaction were now larger than the risks of action. The power shift that this armada represents needs to be stated plainly, because I think the daily operational reporting is obscuring its strategic significance. 6 months ago, Iran's Hormuz strategy was a theoretical threat. Something that war games and military journals took seriously, something that think tanks modeled and briefed to congressional committees, but something that existed in the realm of planning scenarios rather than lived reality. Today it is not theoretical. Iran activated it, sustained it, and used it to hold 20% of the world's oil supply effectively hostage for weeks. That is not a minor geopolitical event. That is a demonstration of asymmetric power that every military planner on the planet is now studying with a level of attention that the scenario never previously commanded. The legal dimension of what the United States is now doing also deserves careful attention. The naval blockade announced on the 13th of April applies specifically to vessels traveling to and from Iranian ports. It does not close the strait to international commercial shipping. That distinction is legally critical, and Washington has been deliberate about maintaining it. But the practical reality on the water is that the line between a blockade of Iranian ports and a contested strait is thinner than any legal framework can fully contain. When Iranian fast attack boats shadow American destroyers at close range and IRGC commanders issue warnings that any military vessel approaching will be treated as a ceasefire violation, the legal architecture of freedom of navigation is being stress tested in ways that international maritime law was never designed to handle at this speed and intensity. On the economic side, the market reaction has been neither brief nor contained. Energy futures moved sharply the moment Iran closed the strait and have not fully recovered. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting to transit the region have climbed to levels that some operators describe as functionally prohibitive. The aluminium producer, Emirates Global Aluminium, declared force majeure on some contracts after missile strikes disrupted its Al Tawila facility, not because the facility was destroyed, but because the closure of Hormuz had already constrained the movement of key inputs needed to keep it running. That is the cascade in motion. Energy disruption becomes industrial disruption, becomes economic disruption, becomes political pressure, paid at the end by people who could not find the Strait of Hormuz on a map, but feel its closure every time they pay their energy bill. Here is what the silence of certain actors tells you about where this is really heading. China stated publicly that the war should not have started and criticized Iran for attacking neighboring countries. That statement coming from Beijing is worth reading very carefully. China gets roughly 40% of its oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. It has enormous economic exposure to a prolonged closure. And its public distancing from Iran's Hormuz strategy, even while maintaining its broader relationship with Tehran, signals that the calculation in Beijing is shifting in ways that matter for how this ends. Russia has said less. That silence is its own message. Moscow has its own reasons for watching American naval power absorb the cost of a sustained Gulf operation, and none of those reasons involve helping resolve the crisis faster than it needs to be resolved. Meanwhile, India deployed over 5 frontline warships to escort Indian-flagged cargo ships stranded west of Hormuz, not inside the strait, but close enough to the crisis that New Delhi's calculation about where its interests actually lie is becoming harder to keep ambiguous. The Gulf states have been the most telling of all. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, governments that depend on the free flow of energy through Hormuz more directly than almost any others, have been largely quiet about the operational details of American naval activity in their waters. That quietness is not neutrality. It is the specific kind of strategic patience that comes from knowing the outcome you need without being willing to publicly commit to the cost of achieving it. They want the strait open. They want American naval power to open it. They would prefer not to say so until after it happens. So where does all of this leave us now, as the Armada holds its position and the mine-clearing operations continue, and the diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran produce nothing that qualifies as a breakthrough? Russia is watching this unfold and drawing conclusions about what sustained American military commitment in a contested waterway actually costs, in resources, in political capital, in alliance cohesion. China is watching and asking itself whether the lesson of Hormuz is that geography-based denial strategies work, or whether the lesson is that they work only until the opponent assembles $100 billion of naval capital and decides the cost of the stalemate exceeds the cost of the campaign. Every regional power with a coastline and an adversary is running its own version of that calculation right now. Iran will adapt. The IRGC has demonstrated repeatedly that tactical setbacks do not translate immediately into strategic surrender. The mine-clearing operation will face deliberate interference. The fast attack boats will probe the edges of the blockade line for gaps. The drone attacks on tankers will continue as long as the operational capacity exists to conduct them. The Hormuz strategy was not designed to win in a single engagement. It was designed to impose cost over time and outlast the political will of an opponent whose attention is always being pulled in 10 directions at once. The image that comes to my mind, and I think it is the right one for this moment, is a key and a lock. Iran spent 40 years engineering the lock. It built the tumblers one by one in the shape of mines and missiles and swarm boats and geography until the lock was genuinely difficult for anyone, including the most powerful navy in the world, to simply force open. The United States has now shown up with the largest key it can cut: $100 billion of naval capital, carrier air wings, mine-clearing systems, and the political commitment to use them. Whether that key actually turns depends not just on the military outcome in the water. It depends on whether the economic and diplomatic pressure generated by the blockade produces the conditions for a negotiated reopening before the cost of the operation itself begins to drive a different political calculation in Washington. That is the question no one has answered yet. And it is the question that will define not just the future of the Strait of Hormuz, but the future of how great powers and regional actors calculate the risk and reward of asymmetric confrontation in the decade ahead. I do not know how this ends. What I know is that the next 30 days will be more consequential than anything that has happened in the preceding 30. Subscribe to this channel. If there are developments in the mine-clearing operation, if the diplomatic track in any of the back-channel conversations produces something real, if the blockade faces a significant test at sea, I will bring you a full breakdown the moment the picture becomes clear enough to read honestly. Wherever you are watching from, I want to hear your analysis in the comments. What do you think Iran does next? What does the Armada's presence actually change? This is the conversation that this moment demands, and it is one that needs voices from every part of the world. Stay close, stay informed. The Strait is not yet open, and the story is far from over.